Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Gary Fowler. I'm the CEO, President, and Founder of GSD Get You Done Venture Studios. Today, we're talking about top global startups. I'm your co-host with my good friend, Bill Reichert, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. So we're going to talk about top 10 lessons learned from founders who did it right. We're diving into the great minds, not only Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Bezos, Nadella, Larry Page, Zuckerberg, and Hoffman, but many more. The real startups that Bill's worked with and I've worked with that have done incredible things. So with that, I'd like to bring Bill on board. But first, I'd like to say he's a partner at Pegasus Tech Ventures. He's managed Pegasus's investments in AI, robotics, quantum computing, neuromorphic, space, and other sectors. He's also the chief evangelist for the Startup World Cup, a platform that connects and supports startup ecosystems all over the world. He's a co-author of the Pitching Guide, Getting to Wow, Silicon Valley Pitch Secrets for Entrepreneurs. Interesting book. Take a look at it if you get a chance. Enchanting. He's been a venture capital investor for 20 years, originally as a co-founder with Guy Kawasaki, a managing director of Garage Technology Ventures, a seed and early stage venture capital firm that was purchased by or acquired by Pegasus. So with that, I'd like to bring my good friend on board. Hey, it's Groundhog Day, Bill.
Hey, Gary. Hey, Gary. Great to see you. Great to see you. Great to be back with you today.
Yes, so we're talking about, let's go down through and Steve Jobs obsessed with design, and he didn't listen to the customers, Bill. We talk about customer development, but he thought he knew better, and obviously he did in a lot of ways. But he obsessed about the curves, every font, every button. And it paid off for him. But is that like, it's not customer development. You're not checking with the customer to see if they like it. You just assume they do and put it out. But is that normal?
Well, so Steve took a path that a number of entrepreneurs take, and which is not sort of the traditional what we talk about in terms of entrepreneurship, where a visionary has a vision of how they're going to make a dent in the universe. And then they get a band of brothers and sisters to come together and, change the world. Think about the history of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, did not have this idea that maybe we take microcomputers to the rest of the world. No. He saw what Woz was doing, and he said, oh my God, there's this new technology called a personal computer or microcomputer or whatever he called it. And I think we can make a business out of it. And then he says, oh, hey, calligraphy shows that there are all sorts of different fonts. I wonder if we could take all that idea and then turn that into something that we could put on our printers. And then he saw that I think SRI had this thing called a mouse. And he said, wow, that's a much better way to do things. And then Xerox PARC had a thing called
I was up there. I was looking at it. They said that's how he got his ideas, right?
Right. So Steve, what his brilliance was, he didn't come up with these great ideas and had this natural instinct for what people would like. What he did is he went out in the world and saw things that were brilliant, and he borrowed them, adapted them, integrated them into things that were at some level already proven. But, he didn't always get it right,
But is that the right way to do it, Bill, to not talk to the customers? Because you hear about customer development, you look at Startup Owner's Manual, Steve Blank and Bob Dorff, they talk about customer development. That's not the way to do it, but...
So this is where, my friend and colleague and partner at Garage, Guy Kawasaki adapts this sort of customer-centric thing. And his point is ship, then test, which is to say, you're not going to get any better customer feedback than if you actually ship a product.
Well,
And
so that's a transition into the next one, right? So
right.
design wins heart, then speed wins markets. Let's talk about shipping fast, even if it's messy, makes all the difference. And let's talk about Mark Zuckerberg, right, at Facebook. His mantra was move fast and break things. So that's what you're saying the guy's mantra was,
Right.
right? So
Right.
is that the right way? And then
Well, okay. And remember, I never said break things.
okay.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, again, this has been an historical sort of realization in entrepreneurship, is that entrepreneurs who are not successful, they overly obsess about engineering to perfection. And that kills them, because that just takes longer, it costs more, and of course you can't engineer to perfection, right? And so they take longer and spend more trying to engineer to perfection. They launch it into the world, and if the world doesn't like it, they're screwed, because they've run out of runway.
Right.
and so you've got to figure out a way to get it out there early on. If again, nobody who's listening to this remembers the original Apple II, I'm sure.
But, I do.
But
I sold them.
we are dating ourselves there, Gary. But I mean, the original Apple II was not nearly as elegant as the microcomputer that Xerox put out. But Xerox spent so much more money getting it out the door than Apple did. And they just they weren't focused on this iteration of improving the software, improving the hardware, finding partnerships, finding developers. And so that's why Apple was more successful than the Xerox Star. So at least that's one explanation for that piece of history. So yes, you've got to get it out there and actually see what customers are going to do. Now, Steve later on decided to launch this next generation computer called the Lisa. A lot of people don't know or remember the story of the Lisa, but he put together this sort of, it was kind of somewhere between the Apple II and the Mac, and threw it out there. It was too expensive. I mean, it was kind of nice. It was better. It was too expensive. It didn't add enough value for people to say, I'm going to spend more for a Lisa than I am for an Apple II. And so, again, to his credit, he didn't particularly invent the Mac. What he did is he found people who could integrate these ideas that came from elsewhere, the graphical user interface, the mouse, the design of the machine to make it, actually you could move it around, it was sort of a semi-portable, if you remember the Mac, right? The original Mac. And he had a great team of designers who had, some good intuitions about what was wrong with the last generation. And so the Mac was an evolution. It was not a revolution, even though they wanted us to believe it was a revolution. And so that's another important characteristic, I think, of successful entrepreneurs, is that they're paying attention to where value is created, where customer excitement is created, and they continuously iterate forward to get customers more and more excited about what it is they're offering.
Yeah, so launch, learn, iterate, and the idea isn't to be perfect. It was to learn, and quickly and keep improving, right? And so launch, learn, iterate. So this is a good transition. So Zuckerberg helps Facebook grow, but sometimes you need more than velocity. You need vision that borders on craziness, right? And that brings us to, and I'm smiling, right? That brings us to a founder who redefined moonshot, or shall we say Mars shot thinking, right?
Okay.
So Elon Musk.
Yeah.
So, he put it all on the line. I mean, it's amazing with SpaceX and Tesla, when he was on the verge of collapse, that he really had to take 20 million out of his own pocket to keep them alive. Today they're reshaping transportation, space travel. I mean, you name it, robots, Starlink. But vision without execution, is hallucination. But bold vision with execution, that's really how you change the world. So, when do you get to a point? So bet on your bold visions. When do you give up, Bill, and when do you keep moving forward?
It's that's a great question. And so what we look for in an entrepreneur, in my experience, in terms of the difference between, success and failure is, yes, your point about vision and then execution, but why do good entrepreneurs keep executing, right? And that has to do with the mindset of the entrepreneur in terms of what their commitment is, what their passion is, and what they are focused on. And unfortunately, you see a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are opportunistic, who, they think they see an opportunity out there in the world to, offer some innovation. And they think, if I can cobble this together and raise enough money, I can get rich. And I don't want to invest in that entrepreneur. I invest in the guys and gals who they see an opportunity out there, and whether or not they knew it in advance, they're going to hit bumps, they're going to hit walls, they're going to hit, hurricanes, and they plow through it. And this is your point about Elon, who bet it all, not because he was trying to make money, but because he was convinced that he was right, that this was the pathway to actually getting a sustainable, reusable, successful space program put together. And so that's what
he did it. I mean, he did it. He told my friend that he read books. So they go to dinner and lunch a lot of times over at Mar-a-Lago, right? He said, really, he read books. He would read 2 books a day at one point. He didn't study to be an engineer, an aeronautical engineer, but it's absolutely incredible. And so, going back to it, so if you're betting on somebody, do you bet on somebody that's conservative, or you bet on somebody that's got a bold vision? If you're going out and you're saying, listen, Pegasus money, we got $2.5 million, what kind of person are you going to bet on?
Yeah, I'm gonna bet on someone who is convinced that they are, that they have the right vision, but they also know that they may not know exactly how to get there from here. And so there's this line between high confidence and arrogance and pigheadedness, right?
Yeah, and the pigheadedness, right? You got to have flexibility. You got to have somebody that's willing to listen, because if not, nothing good happens, right? Because they go down a narrow path in a silo and they don't listen, and they're going off in the wrong direction, and they don't ever course correct.
Right, exactly. And God bless Steve Blank and Eric Ries. They didn't coin the term, but they popularized the term, pivot. You got to know when to pivot, and that's and that's what you see in Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs, it was not a straight line.
No, I agree. I mean, the Apple IIc was something people don't talk about. I remember having one of those, and it was not so interesting, right? But they pivoted, right. And people only think about the positive things. They don't think about the trials and tribulations you go through as an entrepreneur, because it ain't a straight shot. You're going down through it, and you got lefts and rights, and pitfalls and volcanoes coming out. You got all kinds of things happen all the time.
Yeah. No, and one of my favorite entrepreneur stories is the story of Pandora Media. We were the first investors in Pandora Media, founded by a guy named Tim Westergren. And Tim had this vision that he could characterize music using what he called the Music Genome Project. So, after the Human Genome Project, his big idea, he was a musician. He was a musician. And he saw this opportunity to help people discover music that they liked by deconstructing the elements of music. And, so that was the basis on which he launched Pandora. Pandora was not the first music streaming service, but it sort of became the next generation of music streaming services as it came out. It was an 11-year overnight success, but it almost died 3 times along the way. I mean, so a not as visible as the whole Elon Musk process, but Tim, went through hell and back, fighting with the music industry over the music royalty process or regulation or processes. And, he actually convinced Dianne Feinstein to go with him to Congress to change the rules on music streaming. And I mean, unbelievable that this guy he fought tooth and nail to get his vision accepted out there. And it's one of my complaints about life, that even though Pandora was wildly successful and we went public at $3.7 billion, Spotify, drafted on the whole Pandora success, and Spotify, fast follower wins, right? So Spotify took advantage of everything that Tim did. Tim wound up doing perfectly fine, thank you very much. But it was interesting that Spotify actually became more successful than Pandora, on top of all of the hard work that Tim did. But the point is that Tim had an unbelievable persistence. I mean, most everyone else would have given up. And, most of his investors gave up. But a couple of his investors just believed in him and kept supporting him, and managed to make it as an IPO eventually. So that's what we look for in an entrepreneur: is the person who is unbelievably persistent and resilient and focused, but not pig-headed about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, you can't scale now. You can't scale without clarity. You can't scale vision without clarity.
Right.
No one understands metric systems and obsession with customers. I remember this because I watched the Jay Leno show when Jeff Bezos came on, and he turned to Amazon. I remember he made fun of him. He said, "You're bleeding, bleeding money. You're $1 billion down." He was talking about it. But, into a data-obsessed machine, from personalized recommendation to inventory algorithms, every decision at Amazon was backed by numbers. So how important is data as the new oil? And Jeff Bezos, I remember him. He was like, actually, I don't know what's going on with him, but he looks really good now. I don't know about you, but he doesn't look like the same person he did in the early 90s. I mean, he looked kind of nerdy. He doesn't now. I saw him. I was in Monaco or Monte Carlo driving in a Ferrari. He looked like he came out of the Expendables or something.
Okay. I'm not necessarily going to go down that path, but
I just like him. I mean, I told you I just had the stem cell stuff done, and it has profound impact. I'm not saying he did it, but he looks, seems he's just a different kind of person in a good way.
I mean, Jeff Bezos clearly has an, sort of unbelievable degree of intensity. I mean, you just, you see him, you listen to him, and there's just this 1,000 watt intensity that you sense in him. Mm-hmm. And that's a characteristic not everybody loves, not everybody loves being around that level of intensity. But that level of intensity is powerful in getting things done, right? And
So
so,
is it the intensity or the data? Is it
right.
is it you, because you got to base it on something, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he based a lot of what he did on data. Know your numbers better than anyone.
Yeah.
Is it important, Bill? Is it
Yeah.
important to do that, or is it something just forget about it and keep moving forward?
Yeah. No, 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 no. And again, this is, one of, on my top 10 list, which is in the early days of being a startup, you don't have any data really, right? I mean, and so, sort of the early days of being in a startup, you are exploring, you are throwing spaghetti against the wall or whatever the metaphor is you want to use. But what we see is a lot of entrepreneurs who don't make the transition to being data driven. They have this, they've, been taught, again, they misunderstood sort of the whole point of this entrepreneur discovery thing. And they think that because the numbers are so unreliable and because there's so much uncertainty that, we're always in exploration mode. But you've got to make this transition from, exploration mode where I don't have any data or enough data to figuring out, once you decide on pathways, then you've got to instrument your business to collect the data to, monitor whether you're not you're on the right trajectory.
Yeah,
And
no, I
so,
agree. And then when does that happen though? What's that trigger point when you start looking at the data? At what point?
my bias is you've got to start at the very beginning. You've got to start figuring out, sort of for each phase of your development, what are the data I need to collect?
Mm-hmm.
And you have to get into the discipline and habit of collecting data and looking at the data. And so, now very early on, it's going to be highly unreliable, statistically insignificant. But I encourage entrepreneurs, I want them to have a dashboard day one. And, a lot of entrepreneurs, they're sort of doing it by the seat of their pants. And sometimes that works, but eventually you've got to have, a dashboard. You've got to start collecting the data.
So
and watch.
what does that dashboard look like? What kind of
Yeah.
if you look at it,
Yeah.
so from a startup, what would be important for you as an investor to see that they understand their business? Well, I don't mean exactly, but what is it? I mean revenue, traction, or some things. But what kind of things do you look at?
Right. So, I mean, again, it depends on the business you're in. But, I think I've got 7 categories that you should at least be thinking about in terms of measuring and monitoring. One is, of course, cash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Famously, my mentor, Craig Johnson, he loved going around to entrepreneurs and saying, what is the number one cause of death in the startup world? And, oh, well, the team, and oh, no, it's distraction. Oh, no, it's the technology, whatever. And he said, no, the number one cause of death is you run out of money.
Mm-hmm.
That's the number. And so, there are all sorts of reasons why you run out of money, but you better monitor cash day one and figure out how long is this going to last me and what do I do, to make sure that it keeps lasting me, depending upon funding and all that sort of stuff, right? So cash.
No, I agree. People don't. It's funny with the startups, and I don't know about you, but they, when I talk to them, they say, we've got 3 months worth of runway. We just got investment for 6 months, but they got these grand plans. And, I said, wait a second, let's just run the numbers. What are you trying to do? And they don't work. Rarely do they ever work. And I try to tell them this isn't, or sometimes you don't raise enough. What happens, by the way, Bill, if they go down through and they don't raise enough? Cash is king, right? They get down through, they've miscalculated. What happens to them?
Yeah. No, so that's where you find out if you've got the right people on the bus, to use Jim Collins' metaphor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in the case of Pandora, Tim was able to keep the team together because the team was committed to, seeing it through. And so they went for periods of time without pay, to see it through. You cannot count on that. You cannot count on that. And so there are all sorts of ways that entrepreneurs sort of make it through, persistence and resilience, and God damn it, nobody's going to stop me.
Mm-hmm.
But, working backward, you got to make sure you find the right investors, right?
Well, yeah, you got to
make sure you find the right investors. And what I learned, I had some great brand name investors on my companies as an entrepreneur, and they promised me how they could help me with contacts and recruiting and all sorts of things. But I would tell you, that was a lot of smoke and mirrors. And these are great brand name investors, but the number one thing you look for in an investor is to find someone or someones who will make sure you don't run out of money. Because most entrepreneurs are not competent at raising money.
No, I got it. And so when you look at it, so, I'm a psychologist, right? What kind of person would you want, Bill, to be your part? If you look at it, right? What kind of person would you want to have alongside of you in this journey? What is the personality of that person like? What are they? Who would they
mean as a co-founder or as an investor?
As an investor. Yeah, what do they? Yeah, but what do you look like in that person? People that have faith in you, believe in you. I mean, those are, because I'm sure. But what kind of characteristics should they have, and should they be looking for? Because you're right, that's a big problem.
Yeah,
right. You need somebody that's in it to win it with you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so at one end of the spectrum, you've got investors who do not have deep pockets, who have, angel investors who they're not going to write you $1 million check, but they're going to, and so at that end of the spectrum, you want an angel who absolutely, buys into what you are doing and will work with you, is actually, committed to what you are doing, but has an extraordinary network of connections sort of up the venture capital, up the financing, chain. So extraordinary connections. At the other end of the spectrum, you want an investor, a venture firm who has an enthusiasm for very early stage investing and a proven track record of following on. Mm-hmm. Now, and that's what I had.
For following on. I got it.
Right.
And they have an appetite, the risk, the reward. They can guide you through the process, and they also are open their pockets to be able to help you to get through.
Right.
I know, that's fantastic. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Even with great tech and great data, companies fail without one thing, and that's culture, right? So that's where this next, legend, Satya Nadella, when he took over Microsoft, it was really losing relevance. His solution is shift the culture from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. Mm-hmm. And how important is it? So, in terms of impacting things like innovation, empathy, the teamwork, when people work together, they can accomplish all kinds of things because you have a support system, right? They're there to help. But how important is culture, though, in those companies? What do you look for in those startups? What things are trigger points in saying, I really like the culture of this company?
Yeah. No, and that's been a personal evolution on from my experience from when I was an entrepreneur, and I thought culture was sort of implicit and obvious in any startup. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs have this assumption that this is our vision, this is where we want to go, this is our mission, this is what we want to accomplish, and the culture falls out of that, right? So everybody's committed to this vision, but that's not enough. And mm-hmm. I didn't fully appreciate that when I was an entrepreneur. And so when we were starting up our companies, and then so the pivotal experience for me was we were in the conference room and we were trying to make a decision, and we started to yell at each other. I thought, whoa, this can't be good. We're yelling at it. How is that a misalignment? What's going on?
Mm-hmm.
And what I didn't understand at the time is that if you hire a bunch of smart people who are really passionate about what you're doing, that they may have a different perspective than you have. They have different experiences. They have different, expertise and learning. And so, they're going to come to something with a different perspective, and they're going to disagree with you. Mm-hmm. They're going to disagree with you. Now, finding people who will disagree is easy. The hard part is how do you tap that disagreement and turn it into a superpower for your organization? Mm-hmm. This is one of the things that I didn't fully appreciate, but at Microsoft, they yell at each other. At Amazon, they disagree violently. At Intel, historically Intel, they would yell at each other. At Apple, they would fight internally. And so the difference between success and failure is, can you take advantage of that disagreement to find the best path forward and then get the team to align around that decision? So Jeff Bezos found this great quote that nobody seems to know where it came from originally, but Bezos uses this quote, which is disagree, then commit. And so the key to success in a culture is that you respect the perspectives of all the people around the room. You're not the smartest person in the room. That's a key characteristic of a good founder, is the good founder has got to know that they're not the smartest person in every discussion.
Yeah, and how to be able to bring that out of the employees and the other co-founders to be able to get them to open up, because the one thing you don't want to do is shut them down, because they won't do anything. You got to open them up so that they want to explore, they want to work on things, they want to try, and you're supportive, right? So you help nurture them through that process. And it's not easy, right? When you're building a company, because sometimes, you're saying, listen, it's my way or the highway, we got to get it done, but that doesn't work.
Exactly right. And so I coach entrepreneurs on this concept of building a team of leaders and pushing leadership to the edge and hiring people who are leaders, not followers, all the way to the edge, and giving people both the responsibility and the accountability and the support to make decisions at the edge rather than forcing everything back to the center.
Yeah, that's really difficult too, because when you're on the edge like that, if you're not being supported, you're on your own, right? You're a lone wolf, or you're wild. I mean, I've heard it in companies call it different things, a wild cowboy, right?
Well, and that's a culture thing. That's a culture thing. You've got to create a culture that says, I'm out there on the edge, I'm out there at the point of the spear. And I'm having a negotiation with a vendor or a negotiation with a customer. I've got to be smart enough to know where I can sort of make commitments and where I say, gee, I need to involve other people in making this decision. And that's a culture thing. It's a training thing. It's I'm the decider. But everybody has got to have the opportunity to be the decider in a certain domain. But a good decider knows when to seek support from other stakeholders in that decision.
Yeah, no, it takes a while to learn that, right? Not everybody does that right off. So we just talked about Satya Nadella and operating systems. Now, speaking of operating systems, we talked about Larry Page, right? And he created a global one, starting with a college thesis. So, how important, if you take vision and execution, you can get to dominance. Turning the mission in the Google's case, one of the most powerful tech companies in the world, from a little trailer over at Stanford University. Actually, I guess he was in a house in a garage after that. But, but this focus on product and execution. How important is execution, Bill, when you're going down through and building a startup?
Yeah. I mean, of course. Again, it's back to um, you may miss the shot, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? And so execution isn't just about, plan the work the plan, and that's kind of traditional management thinking. Plan the work and work the plan. When you're a startup, you cannot always plan the work and work the plan. Sometimes you have to just try a bunch of stuff to find out what's going to work. But, that's scary to some people, to sort of to be open to the possibility that something that we try may not work. And, and that's sort of, but that's the key to execution, because you can't get things done if you try to plan it out to perfection to make sure that you don't make any mistakes. And so the companies, and this is back to move fast, and it's back to agile, and so execution sounds like it sounds like it is a sort of structured, deterministic process plan. But what we've learned in this world is there are a whole bunch of innovation requires this willingness to try a lot of things. But then, to your point about execution, the problem that a lot of entrepreneurs have is making the transition from everything is ad hoc, which is the reality when you're starting. Everything is ad hoc. Mm-hmm. But as you mature the company, you've got to put in place processes. You've got to say to everybody,
to find out what works. You get some, you get a hit. You got to put some processes around it, and how important is it to continue to iterate, Bill, even when you have the processes in place?
Right. And so you have this sort of a Kaizen, continuous improvement concept that says, okay, we're going to put processes in place. Unfortunately, too many people learn processes from big business, which tend to be more bureaucratic about their processes, or they tend to be more fixed about their processes. Processes are simply a way to standardize an approach to a problem that has already been proven to work, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But sometimes you bump up against something with a process that says, hey, this process is not very functional for solving this particular problem that we now have. So what do? So traditional bureaucrats say, stick to the process, right? Stick to the process, right? But no. I mean, as in a, in a dynamic world, entrepreneurial thinking is, okay, why doesn't this process work for this context? And figure out what's the new process, or what's a different process for this new context. And, that is iteration. You don't know, is that going to be quarterly, annual? Who knows? I mean, so different, things change at a different pace, but you've got to be willing to put processes in place. And so again, a company that I was involved with, very, very innovative entrepreneur, made it. It was, 10 years of growth. They got to, over 100 million ARR. And they were still doing things ad hoc. They was still, we're an entrepreneurial company. And so we don't need no contract management system.
That doesn't sound good.
I mean, right. And so, and so then they filed to go public. And the auditors came in and they said, holy shit, what is going on in here? So, I mean, they were very fortunate that they grew, beautifully, wildly successful, profitable company, but everything inside was a mess. So if you're lucky enough, maybe you can survive without putting processes in place. But I will tell you, it's, too many entrepreneurs resist it. They don't resist it. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it, and so you've got to make sure that you accept, on the one hand, there's certain things that you stabilize around a process. It's just a standard approach to how you do things. You may have a template here, or you may have a form there, whatever, right? Or a checklist or whatever. I mean, it doesn't have to be crazy bureaucratic. But then other things you don't know how to do, and you have to then iterate. And so that combination is not necessarily natural for a lot of entrepreneurs. And so generally that's why, you hire a CFO who's been around the block a few times, who knows, how to put that stuff into place. And you hire an HR person who's been around the block a few times and knows how to put that stuff in place. And you try to keep them under control, that they don't get too bureaucratic on you, but you let them do what they're good at, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And so that brings us to another point. And I wanted I didn't put this down, but I wanted to talk about it. One of the things that we're finding with our companies, it's our 176 companies in GSD, is that by using Perplexity, by using ChatGPT, they're getting superpowers, and they're able to do incredible things, that they could never ever do before, right?
Yep.
Everything, literally, research, almost everything. But how important is it now to be able to incorporate those technologies into your businesses to be able to help you streamline it?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely critical. I mean, it is stunning to me. It's stunning to me to see how we went from just a couple of years ago to, this is interesting, I wonder, to now it's baseline. It is baseline. I mean, if you're doing software programming and you're not using some form of Copilot or like Cursor or something, I mean, you're screwed.
You're in the Stone Ages.
I mean, and if you're not using these tools for research, for generating alternative approaches, A/B testing, right? So now you've got these tools that can frame out, 16 box test matrices like that.
I agree. But they don't do it. It's amazing, because I've gone down through with a number of the startups, our startups in GSD, and I have several thousand prompts now, right? And I play 3 or 4 hours a day. I just like it. And it's amazing the kind of things that you can do that's untapped potential. And these truly are superpowers. So for all the startups out there, take a look at these tools. You better be familiar with them, because if not, nothing good's going to happen, right? Use tools to help yourselves. So, and sometimes the best tools are born from our own pain, right? So if you talk about Drew Houston, you remember Drew Houston's story, right? He founder of Dropbox. He forgot his USB stick a few too many times, and he said, so he built the cloud. So that's how Dropbox came to be. So, build what you need. How many times have you seen entrepreneurs that actually solved the problem because they had their own problem?
Well, I've had this discussion a few times with a few different people about the origin of good ideas, right? Mm-hmm. The origin of good ideas. And our standard rubric, our standard framing for the origin of good ideas is, find a problem and solve it. Or, the variation you said, which is, find a problem you have and solve it, right? And I think that's a pathway, but it's certainly not the only pathway. The other pathway is find an opportunity and exploit it. And so again, Facebook was not solving a problem, right? I mean, so Zuckerberg, every freshman at Harvard gets this book that has everybody who is in your class, in the book. And it was the popular term for it was the Facebook. And,
Oh, really?
yes, right.
That's interesting.
That is, so I still have my Facebook from, my freshman year.
Wow.
and and so every freshman gets gets a, I don't know what it's called, a incoming class register, or whatever they actually formally call it, but we all called it the Facebook. And so, Zuckerberg is, hacking a bunch of different things, and he did he started hacking a hot or not, and that got him into trouble, right? And then he said, one weekend he said, hell, I can just take everybody who's in the Facebook and I can put them online, and I can give them an account, that is their profile. That's a piece of cake. But it wasn't really solving a problem. It wasn't really, it was exploiting an opportunity. And you think about, Netflix. Netflix wasn't really solving a problem. I mean, you could say, yes, it was such a pain to have to go to Blockbuster and blah, blah, blah. No, what Netflix was based on was, hey, someday we're going to be able to stream movies over the internet. And so, let's start a company to take advantage of that technology. When they started the company, it turned out they couldn't do it. They
were having discs in these, right? They had these, in the grocery stores and things.
Right. So what they had to do is they had to figure out a bridge between, today and our vision of the future. And they were incredibly lucky that what had happened was the industry was just flipping from tapes to DVDs. And so nobody was going to mail in, mail out tapes, but DVDs, hey, you can mail those for, 40 cents. And so the idea of using the mail to send movies back and forth was this bridge to the vision. But again, the whole idea of Netflix was not solving a problem. It was exploiting an opportunity. And then, you could go through a lot of successful companies that weren't really solving a problem. They were exploiting an opportunity. When a new technology comes along and a new business model comes along, Uber's not a technology company. Uber did not invent gypsy cabs, right? All Uber did was create a technology platform for gypsy cabs, right?
Yeah.
So once you had once you had sufficient penetration of smartphone access to the internet, then you could create Uber, right? So it's, again, back to, innovation comes sometimes from solving a problem. Steve Jobs wasn't solving a problem that he had. Steve Jobs was exploiting an opportunity. And, and to some extent, I think Steve Wozniak thinks that he was the one who was exploited. But so I encourage entrepreneurs, and or students, don't think of entrepreneurship as necessarily just solving a problem. Think of it also as exploiting an opportunity. What's an evolving technology that will enable you to do something you couldn't do before that a lot of people will benefit from?
You look at it, and we're running a little bit over our time, but you look at it, and really, to summarize, we talked about design obsession, launch fast, bold vision, data driven, culture first, vision and execution, empower the underdog, scratch your own itch with Dropbox. And then, as my friend Jensen, I remember I brought some MBA students to his office at NVIDIA, and I remember building the gaming boards, right, and anticipate where AI is going to go, and look how the world changed. And then your network, right, the networking contacts you mentioned it, Bill, are critically important, right? Having those networking contacts and your support to help each other, your relationship asset management is critically important. So closing thoughts, Bill, and how do people get a hold of you?
So closing thought is, is you have to make a transition from startup to growth and scale up in your mindset, in your skill set, in your processes. And so, be aware of that. As entrepreneurs, be aware that you're going to have to make these transitions from the startup mentality to the scale up and growth mentality around sort of all of these topics that we've talked about in terms of the team and the culture and the problem solving and the innovation strategy, the funding, the partnerships. So all these things, transition as you grow, and be aware of the need to make those transitions. Don't resist them. Watch out for your own compulsion to want to keep things the way they are. Watch out for your own compulsion to want to control things. Big challenge for entrepreneurs is giving up control, is delegating, is trusting the rest of your team. So, watch for that in yourself, watch for that in your team. And then, yes, you can reach me at Pegasus Tech Ventures. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Bill at PegasusVentures.com. And I'm Bill Reichert on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook and wherever else. But
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary, so much.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for joining one more time. Bill's a really good guy. He's been a friend for a long time, and they've got over a $2 billion fund, so check it out. Anyhow, my name's Gary Fowler. I'm your co-host for this edition. Stay happy, stay safe, and stay healthy, and we'll be back to you again in a couple of weeks with another exciting edition. Enjoy your weekend and have some fun. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Gary. Take care.